Sweatshops are the fashion industry's dirty secret. With the rise of fast fashion, garment workers in the United States and around the world are subject to horrendous conditions. But what if I told you that it doesn't have to be this way? Immigrant garment workers of the early 20th century made the ultimate sacrifice for better wages and working conditions. They created a robust, organized labor movement that nearly abolished sweatshops from the United States for over 30 years. So, what went wrong? To answer this question, we'll retrace the history of American garment workers' unions and discover a path forward in the fight against global capitalism. Part 1 of this series will cover the rise of sweatshops, the unions that fought back, and the fire that changed everything. I'm Taipei, and this is the fabric of exploitation. I hurried, but he was never satisfied. By looks and manner, he made me feel that I was not doing enough. I understood that he was taking advantage of me because I was a child. And now that it was dark in the shop, more tears fell on the sleeve lining as I bent over it than there were stitches in it. Rose Cohen, survivor of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. This may surprise you, but the sweatshop is a relatively modern invention, only appearing in the mid to late 19th century, but the incentive to exploit garment workers and drive down wages has always existed. So what changed during this period to facilitate a new system of hyper-exploitation? The answer is technology. During the mid-19th century, a flurry of innovations would lead to the eventual release of functional sewing machines in the 1850s. By the 1880s, sewing machines could perform 2,000 stitches a minute. In comparison, a person hand-stitching can typically only complete around 30 stitches a minute. These miraculous machines made garment workers much more efficient. This ad from 1881 ominously reads, "Special features, the simplicity of movement, a child can operate it. No fatigue to the operator." The sewing machine was marketed with a promise for women's liberation, efficiency, and labor saving. But as is so often the case, workers found themselves working more and earning less. Due to the enormous gap in speed between hand and machine sewing, garment workers couldn't afford not to use a sewing machine. But during the 19th century, sewing machines were prohibitively expensive for most of the working class women who populated the garment industry. As a result, garment workers had to rely on factory owners or subcontractors who could afford to purchase sewing machines. Sewing machines were an objectively incredible feat of technology, but capitalists used this innovation to disenfranchise workers. They pushed the increased overhead costs down to workers and vastly increased their expectations of productivity. Any influence the sewing machine had on power dynamics were materially informed, but ultimately socially constructed. Increased speed was the machine's notable feature, a feature that fit in well with pre-existing systems of exploiting women's sewing energy. These systems had been in the making since the early 19th century, and in typical sewing machine fashion, it merely sped them up. Many a good woman, the sewing machine as a tool for controlling women's productive energies. Sam Huckerby. Tragically, the sewing machine would entrench a new system of sweated labor that still defines the garment industry to this day. The term sweatshop that we're all familiar with comes from this concept of sweated labor, which was first described in the mid-19th century in England. For at the honorable shops, the master deals directly with his workmen, while at the dishonorable ones, the greater part of the work, if not the whole, is let out to contractors, or middlemen, sweaters, who in turn let it out again, so that out of the price paid for labor on each article, not only the workmen, but the sweater, and perhaps the sweater's sweater, and a third and a fourth and a fifth have to draw their profit. And when the labor price has already been beaten down to the lowest possible, how much remains for the workmen after all these deductions? Let the poor fellows themselves say. Cheap clothes and nasty. Charles Kingsley, 1850. This reveals an important dynamic of exploitation within the garment industry. In many instances, fashion retailers don't directly employ garment workers. Instead, they sit atop a complex hierarchy of contractors. This shadowy iceberg allows the retailers, or jobbers, to avoid labor regulations and absolve themselves of financial, moral, and legal responsibility, all the while reaping the lion's share of profits. Physical workplaces themselves also shaped labor dynamics. At the turn of the century, the American garment industry was concentrated in cities like New York, where Jewish and Italian immigrants worked in small, cramped tenement houses on the Lower East Side. But due to electrification, zoning laws, and good old NIMBYism, the New York City garment industry began to shift into a new style of workplace, known as the loft factory. These new spaces were a mixed bag for both employers and workers. Progressive reformers hoped that loft factories would provide better light and ventilation, and while that may have been true, they also allowed for continued worker exploitation. One of these exploitative practices that is still relevant today is known as piecework. Piecework describes a system wherein garment workers are paid per garment they create rather than being paid for their time. This incentivizes speed, not safety or quality. This allowed the contractors or sweaters of early 1900s New York to drive down wages and pressure workers to work at unsafe speeds for extremely long hours, speeds that were facilitated by technological improvements in sewing machines. The machines go like mad all day because the faster you work, the more money you get. Sometimes in my haste, I get my finger caught and the needle goes right through it. I bind the finger up with a piece of cotton and go on working. We all have accidents like that. Days and Dreams by Sadie Frown, 1902. But while exploitation and harassment continued to run rampant in these larger factories, the physical consolidation of workers gave union organizers a new advantage. After decades of toil under the sweatshop system, American garment workers would finally have the opportunity to create a movement of their own and fight back. If you learned something from this video, please consider supporting my work by liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. You can also provide monthly support on my Patreon and gain access to exclusive content, or provide a one-time tip on coffee. Now, let's get back to the video. One of the most important labor unions in this story that will follow throughout the rest of this series is the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or ILGWU. The union was founded on June 3rd of 1900 and initially represented garment districts in major East Coast cities. The ILGWU saw opportunity in the transition from tenement houses to loft factories. In the small disjointed tenement houses of the 19th century, workers were physically separated from one another, which presented a major obstacle to union organizing. Much to the chagrin of their employers, immigrant workers in larger factories found community in one another, where they could share their experiences and disseminate information on the growing union. These immigrant workers also brought unique advantages to the labor movement. At the turn of the century, most New York City garment workers were Jewish people from Eastern Europe or Italians. The immigrant Jewish women and girls of the Lower East Side were inspired by socialist ideals they had been exposed to in Eastern Europe. They organized strikes to protest raising meat prices and high rents, and fostered a new brand of socialism that would resonate with both housewives and factory girls. When pre-industrial Eastern European Jewish values collided with the principles of trade unionism, the result was a new political strategy among housewives that was as volatile as it was effective. Strikes and boycotts by their nature enhance a sense of group consciousness. The frequency of Jewish housewives' protests in the years following 1902 suggest that these immigrant women saw themselves engaged in a common struggle to protect the quality of life of the Jewish working class family. Common Sense and a Little Fire, Annalise Orleck, 1995. Jewish community organizing of the early 20th century would have a profound influence on the women and girls who would go on to lead the garment industry's labor movement. One of these Jewish immigrant workers was Clara Lemlich. After arriving in New York from Ukraine at the age of 19, she began organizing with the local 25 chapter of the ILGWU almost immediately. Ironically, the predominantly male leadership of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union was biased against organizing women garment workers. The problem, Lemlich told her male colleagues, was that women workers had to be approached by an organizer who understood their particular needs as women. The men bristled at the suggestion that this young girl might know more about their business than they did. But years later, one conceded that the failure of the first waistmakers union was due at least in part to their ham-fisted tactics. Clara openly defied male union leadership when her speech in Yiddish helped to ignite a strike of women shirtwaist workers at a meeting in 1909. I am a working girl, one of those who are on strike against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. What we are here to decide is whether we shall or shall not strike. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared now. Clara Lemlich, translated from Yiddish. Cooper Union Meeting, November 22, 1909. The ensuing strike would be known as the Uprising of 20,000, and it was made up of at least 70% female shirtwaist workers. Their battle cry was, "We'd rather starve quickly than starve slow." Striking workers faced physical violence from henchmen hired by manufacturers, as well as the New York City Police Department, and unfair treatment by local courts. The entire commercial, political, and legal apparatus of New York City was against them. But despite violent repression, the strike continued for almost 3 months and resulted in a partial victory for the union. Firstly, many of the smaller garment manufacturers ceded to the union's demands for better wages, shorter hours, and other concrete improvements in working conditions. Second, the strike vastly expanded union membership among female immigrant garment workers. At the end of the strike, approximately 85% of all New York City shirtwaist makers had joined the ILGWU, meaning that the union was crossing both ethno-linguistic and gender lines. The uprising created a new apparatus of bureaucracy for collective bargaining, which sparked debate among union organizers. Socialists and radicals envisioned a new order for workers. Their dilemma to this day is still with working-class activists and trade unions. If revolution is not imminent, if workers require defense inside capitalist society, then a structure that defends them in an industry notable for volatility and dispersion will necessarily place a premium on stability in central leverage. Slaves to Fashion, 2004, Robert J.S. Ross. As I mentioned, the uprising of 20,000 was only a partial victory for garment workers. Many of the larger shirtwaist manufacturers made no concessions to strikers, including the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And just 1 year after the strike was over, this factory would be the site of one of the most infamous industrial disasters in American history, one that would fundamentally transform the American labor movement forever. The shirtwaist, like the one I'm wearing today, was one of the first examples of a ready-to-wear women's garment. Popularized in the late 19th century, the shirtwaist imitated tailored shirts for men's fashion, and was available in a dizzying array of mass-manufactured styles. To some, the shirtwaist symbolized women's independence and economic liberation during the Progressive Era, but the cruel irony of this bourgeois attitude becomes obvious when we investigate the young women and girls who made these garments. On March 25, 1911, the Triangle Waist Company at 2329 Washington Place went up in flames. The fire claimed 146 lives, most of whom were immigrant women and girls. Out of respect for the victims and their families, I will not be going into the graphic details of this disaster, but I will explore the underlying causes and the impact this event had on the trajectory of the American labor movement. The Triangle Fire was a completely preventable disaster. The overcrowded space and poor working conditions led to large amounts of paper sewing patterns and other highly flammable materials piling up, which contributed to the fire's rapid spread. Perhaps the most infamous detail of this disaster was that the factory doors were locked, which trapped workers inside who could have otherwise escaped the fire. The factory owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, would later testify that this was done to prevent garment workers from stealing articles of clothing. Survivors of the fire and their families provide a different story. Rather than loss prevention, workers said that the doors were locked to prevent union members from infiltrating the shop, which was one of the holdouts from the 1909 strike. Even worse, basic safety measures that were demanded by the ILGWU 2 years earlier could have largely prevented this disaster. I was in the Great Shirtwaist Strike. Our bosses won, and we went back to the Triangle Waist Company as an open shop. If the union had had its way, we would have been safe in spite of the fire, for 2 of the union's demands were adequate fire escapes on factory buildings and open doors, giving free access from factories to the street. The bosses defeated us, and we didn't get the open doors or the large fire escapes. And so our friends are dead, and relatives are tearing their hair. Rosie Safran, published in The Independent, 1911. By violently suppressing the 1909 strikes, the owners of the Triangle Waist Company successfully kept the union out of their shop, ensuring their unchecked profits and their workers' demise. Unfortunately, industrial disasters like the Triangle Fire were not unusual for the time, but unlike most tragedies of the working class, the Triangle Fire would generate enormous media attention and public outrage. In contrast to other contemporary disasters that happened in remote areas, the Triangle Fire happened in the heart of New York City, and therefore had a plethora of eyewitness testimonials. The public spectacle of the fire fueled a frenetic media storm that spread news of the disaster across the country. Due to a combination of media coverage, local protests, and public outrage, politicians at the New York State level responded. Over the next few years, the New York State Factory Investigating Committee performed the largest investigation of industrial working conditions in American history up to that point. The investigation covered over 3,000 workplaces across the state of New York and collected over 7,000 pages of testimonials. Fire safety within the garment industry was a priority, but the investigation was much broader than just that. It covered industries like chemical manufacturing and meatpacking, and investigated sanitation, labor abuses, and more. It is because of this neglect of the human factor that we have found so many preventable defects in industrial establishments. It is because of utter neglect on the part of many employers that so many dangerous elements are found in certain trades. In the matter of industrial production, we are still under the sway of the old laissez-faire policy, and there is still very inadequate supervision of industries with a view to lessening dangers to the health and life of the working class. Preliminary Report of the Factory Investigating Commission, 1912. The Triangle Fire and the ensuing investigations by the state of New York would have 3 major impacts: strengthening of the unions, public awareness, and legislative reform. Firstly, the ILGWU was at the forefront of public awareness campaigns in the wake of the fire. As a result of this political momentum, as well as the economic conditions of World War I, union membership for American garment workers peaked in 1918 at 129,000. Second, the Triangle Fire would awaken public awareness about labor and safety issues at the national level, and arguably paved the way for further reforms in the coming decades that we'll discuss later. Finally, the Factory Investigating Commission was able to advance legislative reform at the New York State level, with limitations. Conservative resistance to labor reform grew over the course of the 1910s, and many of the proposed bills would be vetoed by the governor. The unionization of American garment workers was not an overnight success story. Over the course of the 19th and early 20th century, the mechanization of sewing had enabled capitalists to accelerate labor exploitation through the sweatshop system. Immigrant garment workers fought back. Armed with socialist ideals and a close-knit community of Jewish immigrant women and girls, leaders like Clara Lemlich ignited a labor movement within the New York garment industry. After nearly 2 decades of organizing, and one of the most horrific industrial disasters in American history, the Union and its allies had finally laid the groundwork for lasting labor reform. But the fight wasn't over yet. By the 1930s, the Great Depression posed a mortal threat to the American working class. But by some miracle, the garment workers' labor movement would not only survive the Depression, but emerge stronger than ever. If you'd like for this story to continue in part 2, please consider supporting my work directly. I'm Taipei, and until next time,